Welcome everyone to Raise the Roof. Today we're going back in time to 2020 when I went one-on-one with Richard Weikart to discuss how the Darwinian worldview helped create the scientific racism of the 20th century through the eugenics movement. The show goes beyond the history and explores how this Darwinian thinking influences science, religion, and public policy today. Before we dive in, don't forget to follow and rate the show on your favorite podcasting service. And remember, if you want to participate with me in a subscribers-only question and answer, you can sign up through my website, morethancake.org. For those of you who don't know, I got a lot of respect for you, Richard, for all the stuff you've written. You've done a lot of great books that have been, I was telling you in our little pre-show prep, that have been a blessing to me in some of my studies and research into human sacredness and just where I'm taking a lot of my studies. So appreciate you doing it and coming on. It means a lot to me, so I'm thankful. I want to introduce more of your stuff to more people, so this is a great way to do it. So for those who don't know or that don't read or whatever, have ever discussed this topic of eugenics, which we want to look at today, Richard has written multiple books that touch on this area from different angles. His original book, From Darwin to Hitler, related to his PhD stuff that he did over seas, and it's a great book, great resource. But then he's done Hitler's Ethic, Hitler's Religion, The Death of Humanity. I think those are the big ones, right, that I've covered?
Yeah, those are the main ones, yeah.
Yeah, and then he's currently working on a new book on eugenics, specifically in the United States, right? Specifically in America?
No, it's not actually on the United States. It's, the book I'm working on now is actually on Darwinian racism in the Nazi worldview. I do actually, the last chapter does touch on the U.S. because I do talk about neo-Nazis and white nationalists, and that part does cover U.S. Material. But most of it is still dealing with the Nazi period.
Oh, okay.
And I have actually, the first chapter actually deals with Charles Darwin himself, so I look at Charles Darwin's racism. So that's the first chapter. Then there's six chapters on the Nazi period, and then the final chapter on white nationalism and neo-Nazism and the alt-right.
Well, that's good. Well, see, that leaves room for me to actually do something with my research in the future, because you haven't covered every single aspect of eugenics. So for the rest of us poor schlubs that are coming, bringing up the rear of this train, there's some room. You left something for us to write on. So, because I've been looking at a lot of American stuff, and it's just really fascinating. And just the crossovers is great, by the way. But so, hey, for those people that are tuning in that don't know, can you give us a quick definition of what is eugenics, and what just sort of like what's the Webster's kind of version of that? What could people understand it as?
Yeah, eugenics actually comes from the root words that mean good heredity, and so it was a movement that began in the 1860s with Francis Galton that was aimed at trying to promote good heredity, trying to improve human heredity. And there was a lot of fears around, especially by the end of the 19th century, that human heredity was declining, that we were seeing more people with disabilities, mental problems, and other kinds of things. And so there's this tremendous fear that, oh no, we're going the wrong direction in terms of our biological makeup. And so the idea was we need to take measures to try to improve humans biologically.
Yeah, and I know that a lot of people think of eugenics often as just racial cleansing, or when we throw the name Hitler out there, we think, if it's not happening inside of a concentration camp of some kind, then it's not. But it was a lot of other things too. It was just marriage laws, right? And it was also different things to kind of keep people from getting pregnant and medical things.
Sure.
Right. Yeah, so it crossed a lot over.
A lot of historians have divided eugenics ideas into two main categories: positive eugenics and negative eugenics. Positive eugenics was the idea of trying to do things to promote the prolific reproduction of those with what they considered good hereditary traits. So the people that are more intellectual, people that have better physical characteristics, or whatever it is that you're trying to cultivate. So that's positive eugenics. So it's trying to promote having big families, for those that have these positive traits, in their view anyway. The negative eugenics was the idea of trying to prevent the reproduction of those who were defined as having negative traits. So people that were mentally ill, or people that had physical disabilities, people who were blind or deaf or whatever, trying to find ways to prevent them from reproducing. And of course, there were within each of those categories, there were different ideas about policies and what you could do to actually try to do that. And the negative eugenics probably actually had a bigger impact in legislation and of actual concrete policies that were introduced to try to implement it. And one of the most thoroughgoing ways of doing that was trying to sterilize people. Well, I should say thoroughgoing. I mean, the Nazis even went to the extent of euthanasia, trying to kill people, with with disabilities, not just mental, but actually blindness and other kinds of disabilities. So they went to the extent of killing them. In the United States, however, there were quite a number of states that had sterilization laws. So there's compulsory sterilization for people who were mentally ill or had other traits that were defined as being, negative or ill, hereditary illnesses and such. So there's a lot of different ways that people tried to get at eugenics and trying to promote it. And it varied from one person to the other, one eugenicist to the other, of how far they went in that sphere. The most radical ones did promote infanticide, abortion, and even killing of disabled adults at times. Not all eugenicists promoted that, of course. Many eugenicists were horrified by that kind of idea, but many promoted sterilization or other kinds of marriage prohibitions or other kinds of things.
And when you talk about this too, I think what's interesting is, the question I was kind of wondering or wanted people to kind of consider is, why is your upcoming book, why is this what you're talking about important for us to know? I mean, how is it relevant, whether these things happened 100 years ago, 50 years ago, if we're talking about Nazi, 60 years ago, 70? Why is this sort of exploration of the history even relevant to our world? Haven't we just gone, it's 2020, certainly we don't do these things today. So I think that's the mentality for a lot of people. So maybe explain to people why they should pick up a book like what you're talking about, why it's meaningful.
Well, the word eugenics actually became sort of a dirty word after the World War II, in large part because of the Nazi use of it. But actually, in the 1990s, there were some who began trying to redeem the word once again, because we are still living in a world where people are still trying to promote these kinds of ideas. I mean, there's a transhumanist movement right now that has some very prominent leaders, Oxford University professors, that is trying to promote selecting certain traits of humans and identifying them and trying to get those into the gene pool for the next generation and such. So, and there's negative eugenics going on too. I mean, amniocentesis is being used to try to kill babies in utero who are identified as having traits that are considered defective. So Iceland a few years back was jubilant that they had eliminated 100% of people with Down syndrome. Well, how did they do that? They did them by aborting the fetuses who had amniocentesis and who are identified then as having Down syndrome. So we're still living with the same kinds of ideas about trying to eliminate people with different kinds of disabilities, about trying to promote people with other kinds of biological traits and such. So these debates are still going on today. And one of the underlying mentalities that goes behind the eugenics movement, and that I deal with a great deal in my book, The Death of Humanity especially, is the idea that certain human lives have value and other human lives don't have value, or certain have more value and certain have lesser value. In fact, in the eugenics movement, it's interesting, in the early 20th century, there was a lot of eugenicists who were bandying about terms like inferior, and on the other hand, superior. But on the negative side, they were banning about terms of people with disabilities as being weeds, noxious, unfit, or even I've even seen ones calling them people of negative value. So not only did they have no value, they had negative value. They were a burden on society. There's another term that was used quite frequently about these people. Well, these same attitudes are still being rehashed today in a lot of venues. So I think these are still live debates.
Yeah, well, it reminded me too what you're saying. Even Hitler's phrase, life unworthy of life. The idea that there's people that are alive that just aren't worthy. And I think that's what what I think is the most important part of this is that what people have to understand when we talk about the racial component of it, whether it be skin color, although I think historically they tend to see race as one human race, but it was sort of lower or higher kind of thing as opposed to multiracial kind of things. But still, the idea that somebody today may say, well, we don't do it based on black and white, but that doesn't mean they're not picking other arbitrary characteristics to just replace that one. They're still devaluing certain life, right, based on some selection of characteristics.
Yeah, and a lot of times the characteristics were based on rationality, so it had to do with how much mental power you had. And I think that's actually more prominent, especially among intellectuals who are pushing it today. And people like Peter Singer, for example, who's promoting ideas about infanticide and euthanasia and such. And basically, he bases it on rationality, the ability to be able to plan the future and other kinds of things that do with rational capabilities. Well, of course, he's a Princeton professor. He's high on the pecking order of rationality, So this isn't going to affect him unless he becomes suffers from dementia later in life or something like that. But this was a common trait also earlier on, that it was based on rationality. But interestingly, you're talking about the racial aspect. Of course, in the early 20th century, many of these eugenicists, many physicians, anthropologists, actually thought that people of other races, such as Black Africans, Australian Aborigines, even perhaps American Indians, that they were lower in mental powers. And so they're sort of were, both of these things are sort of going hand together. It wasn't just because their skin color was different. It's because they thought that they were intellectually different and even morally different. And that's a point I bring out, by the way, in this new book I'm putting out about Darwinian racism, that they considered the moral stature of different peoples to be different. So they thought that Black Africans were less moral, less cooperative, less hardworking, and all these good moral traits that they thought. Whereas they thought that Europeans were hardworking, diligent, honest, thrifty. Think of all the good character traits you can think of. They ascribed these all to the Europeans, and all had these negative traits ascribed to then Black Africans and others. And these ideas, by the way, are still being rehashed by white nationalists today. I was pretty astonished at how parallel the ideas, which shouldn't really have astonished me, because they are, after all, often called neo-Nazis. So they're just taking the ideas that were around in the early 20th century that were fairly common among physical anthropologists, not just in Germany, but also in the United States and such. And they're taking these racist ideas and recycling them.
Yeah. Hey, well, we did get one comment, mostly I think critical of me. I think they like you, but I'm not sure. Somebody named Brett, I'll put up the comment. He's basically asking, he wants you to remind me, because he thinks I don't understand this, but the institutional racism, the idea that what we did to institutionalize these things existed long before Darwin, and it wasn't his fault, and he was a good guy, and that racism existed long before that. So maybe that's a good point to just clarify, even at this point in our discussion, when you even talk about Darwin to Hitler and his views and how that advanced that sort of scientific understanding of race and what was used in these white nationalist groups and by Hitler. That's not to suggest by you or me, sorry, Brett, but that Darwin invented the idea of racism or institutionalizing that practice, right?
Sure, yeah. Racism was around far before Darwin, and Darwin was going to build upon ideas of race that pre-existed by centuries, thinking. But what's interesting in the context of Darwin's own thinking is that he took these ideas and he used racism as a way to try to prove his theory of evolution. That is, he used it as evidence for his theory. So one of the things that he had to prove in order to prove human evolution, which was, by the way, one of the biggest sticking points, is one of the most controversial ideas, and he knew it was the most controversial idea, which is why he didn't say very much about it in Origin of Species. He barely mentioned human evolution in the Origin of Species. Right toward the end, the last couple pages, he just makes a very brief comment about light maybe thrown upon human origins, but he doesn't really discuss it. Then, of course, after the cat was out of the bag, after everyone else had already discussed it, and after lots of other people had already published about it, 12 years later, then he published his Descent of Man, where he actually does lay it out in great detail. But in the Descent of Man, one of his main ways of trying to argue for human evolution was to argue that there's variation within the species, which, of course, is what he'd argued in Origin of Species relating to other species. He has to argue there's lots of variation within species, and he has to try to minimize the variation between different species to try to show that it's just a continuum. There's no, discrete, these species are just, there's no discrete species that have been separately created or anything like that. He's trying to show they just sort of blend together. So the way he did this with humans was to argue that Australian Aborigines, Black Africans and such are closer to apes than are Europeans, and that the Europeans and the Africans then have lots of differences between them intellectually and also morally. And so he has a couple of chapters, in fact, just on race, and he has actually about a 3-page section in The Descent of Man that's entitled On the Extermination of Human Races. And in that 3-page section, he argues that some races are necessarily going to go extinct in the universal struggle for existence that's taking place because of the competition. And as he saw the Europeans going out and actually doing that is committing genocide against Australian Aborigines, against Tasmanians, against American Indians. In South America, where he had some more direct experience on his voyage of the Beagle, he went around the world on a voyage of the Beagle in the late 1820s, early 1830s. So he had direct knowledge of some of this that was going on. And in fact, during that time, he also visited some of the South Sea Islands, too, on that voyage and had experience there, knowing about what the Europeans were doing. So he knew that the Europeans were going out and committing genocide. He actually saw that as a progressive force, that the Europeans were displacing these allegedly inferior people with the superior Europeans. Now, again, Darwin got these ideas fit very much into the Victorian context. He didn't originate these ideas. These were ideas that were around with most British imperialists of the time. But Darwin did share those ideas and tried to promote them as a scientific theory. Then after Darwin's time, after it became enshrined in his own thinking, and once biological determinism became more prominent by the 1890s and early 1900s, then Darwin's theory was used, interestingly, then to buttress the ideas of racism. And then there were people by the 1890s and early 1900s who argued that Darwinism proved racism. So Darwin was saying that racism proves Darwinism. And then after him came quite a number of thinkers that said Darwinism proves racism. Once you accept Darwinism, they said, then that proves there's variation in the human species. And so then, they use this then to argue for racism.
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a circular kind of argument then ultimately is what you're saying is that, Darwin didn't invent those things, but he used it to validate his theories. And then once his theories were sort of like, I guess, the scientific consensus, then that became the grounding to say, well, then we're okay in doing these things. And I think that's a point worth maybe spending a couple seconds on. How is eugenics really a reflection of the scientific consensus of the day? Because that's a word I think we throw around a lot today. Scientific consensus. Science says, scientists tell us. And we use that as if that has some sort of moral persuasion for whatever our goals are. Science tells us this, so therefore we must do this, as if that controls our public policy. So I think it should be helpful to most people to understand is that science may tell us stuff, but that doesn't mean that it's telling us the right things or what the right things are to do morally in response to it. So how was eugenics the scientific consensus of the day?
Well, let me just say this before I get into exactly that question, because we were just talking about racism, and maybe I should just tie in the racism with eugenics too before we move into this, because racism and eugenics are two separate ideas. You could be a eugenicist, in fact, without being a racist. That is theoretically possible, just like it's theoretically possible to be a Darwinist without being a racist. Those two things are not necessarily linked.
Exactly.
Historically, they were pretty closely linked, and most eugenicists in the 1890s and early 1900s were racists. But the idea of eugenics was just improving human heredity. So you could be a non-racist and believe that you could want to improve human heredity because you want to improve all human heredity of people of all races everywhere and such. So it didn't have to necessarily be racist. The fact is, though, that most eugenicists in the 1890s and early 1900s were racist, and they saw that as part of the eugenics program. So a lot of times, most of what they were focusing on, though, was within their society trying to improve human heredity. So let's say in Germany, where I've done most of my research, or in the United States, most of the scientists in Germany and in the United States that were promoting eugenics were actually promoting it within their own country. They were trying to pass legislation to try to improve the heredity within the United States, or improve human heredity within Germany. Now, in the United States, of course, there was more multiracialism in the United States, so sometimes that did become more closely linked to racism. People promoting anti-miscegenation laws, for example. Some of them were very much seeing this as a eugenics approach. Immigration laws, anti-immigration laws. In fact, the 1924 American anti-immigration law, or American immigration law, was predicated upon eugenics in that they were trying to weed out immigration from people that they considered lesser hereditarily. So people from Southern Europe they considered inferior to people from Northern Europe, and so they wanted to put stricter percentage, less. They wanted less immigration from those places. They wanted less immigration from China. They wanted less immigration from other parts of the world where they thought people's heredity was, they were biologically inferior to the white Anglo-Saxons. And so there were close connections between the racism and the eugenics movement. Now, the question you just asked, let's see. Well, at the time in the 1890s and first couple of decades of the 20th century, the scientific consensus for both scientific racism and for eugenics was pretty strong. Most scientists did tend to believe in both of those things. If you look at the geneticists of the day, Charles Davenport was a Harvard University geneticist. He became really the leading figure within the American eugenics movement. He founded a laboratory at Cold Spring Harbor on Long Island in New York that was actually called the Laboratory for Experimental Evolution. That was the title of his lab, and then it also established a few years. That was established in, I think, 1904, right about there anyway, right at the first few years of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. And then in 1910, they established the Eugenics Records Office, which was trying to investigate genealogies. So Charles Davenport was one of the leading geneticists in the United States. He was not some fringe person or something like that. And if you look at other geneticists in the United States at the time, it was very mainstream. There were courses in eugenics that were being taught in American colleges and universities around all across the U.S.
Yeah. I've seen some exams people have posted like old tests. Which of these people would you not want to see reproduce? I mean, they were asking like these questions on these exams.
And the same thing was true in Germany as well. In again, a lot of my investigations, historical investigations, in the German field, medical professors, anthropologists, psychiatrists were, not that every one of them was a eugenicist. That's, of course, not the case either, but probably a majority, and certainly it was considered sort of mainstream scientific and public policy ideas at the time in the science community. There was a lot of pushback. A lot of the pushback that came against eugenics, especially in the early 20th century, was from the Catholic Church, which was probably the largest institution to strongly oppose it, as well as some conservative Protestants. The liberal sort of mainline Protestant denominations, though, generally lined up with eugenics. Again, it was considered sort of mainstream progressive ideas, and many of them embraced it as well in the early 20th century. There's actually a good book by Christine Rosen called Preaching Eugenics that talks about that issue, about those that were within the religious community who were pressing for eugenics. And she argues that the Catholic Church and some conservative Protestants were the main forces who were opposing it in the places that did oppose it. In the United States, think about how mainstream it became. In the United States, by the 1930s, more than half the United States had compulsory sterilization laws, which had eugenics as their purpose.
Yeah, and that actually, you're so good at this interview stuff. I don't even have to ask my questions because you're ahead of me. So, but see, make my life so much easier. No, but I did want to maybe just emphasize that a little bit and touch on that idea of how that scientific consensus maybe influenced the church. Because in discussing this, I think a lot of times the pushback I get is, well, you're arguing that this is, Christians good, non-Christians bad, and I don't think that's the nature of this thing. I think, in my understanding, there are many Christians like Pierre Teilhard de Chardin who have done a little bit of study on, some others who really integrated those ideas. So in your study, maybe you did more in the Germany side or from even the U.S., what you've read. Rosen's book is excellent, by the way, a source for that. What's your take on, was there broad consensus in the church? Was that a minority in the church, Catholic, Protestant, that embraced that, taking the lead of, what this was the sort of the consensus of the day, and we're just sort of going to follow along with that? Because I know that Rosen brings up, preaching contests they had in the United States where send in your best eugenics sermon. But how prevalent was that? Was that really instrumental in a lot of the church or just a smaller segment? What's your take?
In Germany, theology tended to be much more liberal than in the United States, at least more widespread liberalism. Of course, in the mainstream American churches, there also was a lot of theological liberalism as well. But in Germany, it was even more widespread. And there was, in the Protestant church, there was much less sort of conservative forces
can
theologically. And so there were...
Let me interrupt just real quick, before you go, because that's a great point. But I know some people may get lost when you're saying theologically liberal or theologically conservative. That's not the same as political liberal or political conservative today, right? So maybe just put a little dot on that I and explain to people what you mean by that brief as quickly as you can. I don't want to distract from your main point, but I don't want people to lose you either thinking you're making a political claim here.
Yeah. Those that would be considered theologically liberal would be those who were generally not believing in the miracles of the Bible, for example, not believing that the biblical text is infallible and such like that. The conservatives, on the other hand, would be those who were generally held to the miracles of the Bible and the infallibility of the biblical text. So it's sort of in a nutshell, that's pretty much broadly the camps that we're defining. Obviously, there's a huge continuum, so it's hard to nail this down, but those are sort of the two, sides that we're sort of broadly talking about. But Germany did tend to be more theologically liberal than the United States, and because of that, they did tend to be more accepting of sort of whatever the scientists said, whatever progressives said, rather than combative and opposing it. Interestingly, the Catholic Church was much less accepting of the forces of theological liberalism, and as a result, they did tend to reject eugenics, especially when it began impinging on things that they thought were contrary to moral philosophy.
Yeah.
So when people started talking about sterilization, the Catholic Church didn't approve of sterilization for any reason, really. When eugenicists start pressing for sterilization, many Catholics, not all, there were actually some Catholics that were willing to go along with that, but most Catholics rejected that. And certainly once they started moving on to killing people with disabilities, the Catholic Church was going to be one of the strongest voices against that. When the Nazis began moving in 1939 to begin killing people with disabilities in their so-called euthanasia program, where they killed over the course of the war about 200,000 Germans plus tens of thousands of others in occupied countries. The Catholic Church was one of the strongest voices to protest against it. One of the bishops of Münster, Bishop Galen, preached a sermon very strongly against it in the summer of 1941. There also were a few Protestant voices who, not publicly but privately, wrote letters to Hitler and such, things like that, although they were basically told to shut up and back off, and they didn't go public with it. Galen actually did go public with his sermons. In fact, the British actually leafleted German cities with Galen's sermons about euthanasia and such, because they knew that even a lot of Germans would support euthanasia, that is the killing of people with disabilities. Yeah. So the Catholic Church did form something of a bastion in Germany in rejecting these ideas. So again, in thinking about the German context, there were people, and of course there were Catholic scientists and such too, although one of the more prominent Catholic scientists named Muckerman was actually involved in eugenics and promoted eugenics. So some Catholic scientists went along with eugenics craze as well.
That's really important, I think, for people to recognize. And one of the things that I've tried to look at in my studies is I think that Christians can be a voice for things even against the sort of consensus, but there's a moral grounding for that outside of science that we can kind of hold on to. And when we let go of that, often it does not end well for society when we kind of give in to those pressures.
One of the interesting things there, I think, is that a lot of times what happens is that scientists, when they are pressing for certain public policy positions, so eugenics was supposed to be based upon science, but then, of course, what to do about that is actually public policy. Then do you sterilize people? Do you put marriage prohibitions? What do you do about that? And a lot of times the scientists confused their science, which in this case wasn't on shaky ground as it was, but even if it had been good science, they confused their science with public policy. And thought that because they knew the science, that therefore what they were proposing for public policy had to be what has to happen. I think we can see this happening in a lot of respects. I don't want to get into all these issues today about those particular issues, but I think we can see that today too, the very same kind of things happening, where scientists think, well, because I know my science and my science points to X, Y, or Z, therefore the public policy implications of it have to be this, this, and this. And what happens is they forget about all the other things that may be important in life or might be going on, or that one thing that they're focusing on may not be the only consideration. There may be other considerations that public policy has to take into account, because public policy has to take a myriad of things into consideration as to what is going to produce the best result for us as humans. So when you get fixated on one thing, and sometimes scientists do this, but we all do. I mean, I'm not saying just scientists, okay? Yeah. All humans do this sometimes. If you get fixated on one thing and you think that therefore that my science says this, and then therefore the public policy has to be this, there may be other moral considerations that other people may have. And that's, I think, part of what happened in the early 20th century. The Catholic Church had moral grounds to reject sterilization and euthanasia, and they tried to apply those things, and they were called obscurantists. They were called anti-scientific, for doing that, for trying to raise moral objections to the public policy proposals being made by scientists. And scientists were claiming that what they were doing was scientific, and that basically case closed, as far as they were concerned.
Yeah. And what you said there is such a great example of why the research you do that goes back 50, 60, 100 years is so relevant to today, because I think for me, at least, when we study it outside of our own immediate context, it gives us a perspective to see what's happening today and say, okay, wait a second. If that was true then, and this happened then maybe I need to be more cautious how I'm observing this thing today. And we've done whole shows, our group on Off the Cuff, we've done whole shows on science. What are the limits of science? How do we read? We did a whole show just reading headlines and stories and showing people where they've made that same error you just pointed out, where they assume policy. They assume science leads to a specific policy, and even the writers. It's not just, like you said, scientists. It's the people writing stuff, and politicians say, oh, well, COVID-19 caused this to happen. It's like, no, wait. No, there's a policy that was enacted in response to it, which may or may not be right policy. Like you said, I don't want to get into that, but no, it's the policy, the consequence of the policy, not the actual stuff itself that caused that. And if we're not careful in making that distinction, we end up going down that sort of road in the wrong direction. I think that's what you're kind of pointing out here as a great illustration of why it matters so much. Well, let me ask you this then. There's a lot of people that are concerned about institutionalized racism. I've used that before, and I like you. I say, I don't believe racism itself is entailed by Darwinian viewpoints, but it is coherent with the Darwinian worldview. So it's not necessary, but it isn't fought against either. There's nothing within that grounding that can say it's bad. But I guess what I would want to say is, how was racism or other issues of dehumanization, how are those institutionalized in the eugenics laws that got passed, whether in Germany or the U.S., whatever you have kind of that background on top of your head? What did that look like when it came down to laws? How did that scientific consensus impact the way people were dealt with? Are there some specific things you've discovered in your study, especially for this new book, that people might be surprised to learn?
The biggest one was the sterilization laws, which began in 1907. Indiana was the first state in the United States to pass a compulsory sterilization law in 1907. And many states, California, where I'm at now, they passed theirs in 1909. California accounted for roughly 30,000 compulsory sterilizations from 1909 up until the 1960s or so. I'm not sure exactly when they ended it, but somewhere around there. Many other states we're going to continue on too. And in fact, in terms of the legal framework, these laws did end up getting challenged all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 1927, the famous Buck versus Bell decision about eugenics, Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the majority opinion for the court, which was very heavily lopsided in favor of this opinion that compulsory sterilization was appropriate, constitutional, that it could be legal. They didn't mandate it, of course, but they were just defending a law that Virginia had. It was the Virginia law that was being under consideration at that point. And they decided that, as Oliver Wendell Holmes famously said, that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. That was referring to the generations of Carrie Buck and her offspring and her parents. In that decision, Holmes also stated that the laws that allowed for compulsory vaccination, which some states had at that time, were basically the same thing as cutting the fallopian tubes. He drew that analogy. So legally in the United States, sterilization was considered a legitimate practice favoring public health. Public health demands that we, compulsorily sterilize certain people. And so about 60,000 people in the United States were compulsorily sterilized, about half of those in the state of California. over the course of these eugenics laws being in existence. Then of course, Nazi Germany was going to take this to the greatest extremes. They not only passed a compulsory sterilization law when they came in power in 1933, but then they also began killing people with disabilities later on. But it wasn't just Nazi Germany and the United States. Interestingly, the Scandinavian countries were on the forefront of passing sterilization laws. So we think of Scandinavian countries being progressive, and in many senses they were progressive, but eugenics was considered a progressive cause, in fact, in the early 20th century to a very large degree. Not that there weren't conservatives that held it as well, but many of them were progressives. So Scandinavia, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, they passed compulsory sterilization laws as well. This was some of the more dramatic ideas relating to the legal issues relating to eugenics. The other issue that sort of touches on it, though, was the immigration law that I mentioned earlier, 1924 U.S. immigration law, which was also being pushed very strongly by eugenicists. Charles Davenport, Harry Laughlin. Harry Laughlin was sort of Charles Davenport's right-hand man at the Eugenics Record Office. Laughlin actually went to testify to Congress for that law to try to make sure that people with sort of better heredity, as they saw it, would be able to come into the United States, and people with, what they considered inferior heredity would not be allowed to come in. So these are the kinds of laws that were actually implemented in the United States. But again, some other countries did this as well. Interestingly, Britain, where the eugenics movement began, never actually passed a sterilization law for eugenics. Yeah, no, Britain never did.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think it's good to point out here, too, as you mentioned earlier, whites who were from Southern Europe were considered lower, and so were people who were in poverty, because that was considered, or mental disease, they were also considered biologically inferior to some degree, so that they were on the chopping block as well. So if you were poor, they wanted you not marrying above your station, so to speak, because you would pass on the poor genes, I guess you could say.
Yeah, that's right. And a lot of times they sort of thought that your socioeconomic status was commensurate with your abilities, mental abilities, physical abilities and such. And so there tended to be this idea that, we're a meritocracy. So, the people that can achieve are going to, and the people that are not achieving just don't have the same abilities that other people have. And so, yes, there was very often this notion of people who are poor because they deserve to be poor and they deserve to lose in the struggle for existence, whereas people who are rich are more talented and have greater abilities and such. And so there was no acknowledgement of social and economic circumstances that people came from shaping that. Yeah. Interestingly, though, in Germany, there was a little twist to this, though, because Hitler, his party was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and so he actually did have a lot of sympathy for the working class in a lot of his rhetoric and such. And he actually argued that the German working class, that the reason that many of them were living in poverty was because of capitalists oppressing them and getting the edge on them because of unfavorable socioeconomic conditions that they had. So when he looked at successful Jews, he thought that they were successful because they were conniving and, and deceitful and trickery and other greed and other kinds of things. And he was standing up for the German working class. In the United States, you don't see so much of that. You see, again, at least in the eugenics movement, you don't. In the eugenics movement, largely, I think you're right. It's people who are the lower socioeconomic strata are considered to be sort of losers in the struggle for existence, and in the eyes of many eugenicists, sort of good riddance.
Yeah. One example I know, and this is more of a controversial one, so I'm curious to know, I know you wrote about this a little bit on Death of Humanity. There's a lot of discussion about Margaret Sanger, Planned Parenthood, and so maybe you can help people understand, what was her connections to eugenics? Was she really trying to purify the human race by, promoting abortion, or was she just somebody truly concerned with the greater cause of humanity, or maybe both? And maybe she truly was generally concerned, but she thought the way that there was to eliminate poor and black people. That seems to be what I've read a little bit of it, but I'm sure you've done a lot more study and read some more sources that maybe some of us don't have access to. Where does that story fit into the story you've been exploring these many years?
Well, Sanger's a very interesting character and very complex in a number of ways. For one thing, in terms of her own personal experience, she did sort of get into her interest in birth control by having personal experience with women who were wanting to restrict their births, limit their births. And so she did have a lot of empathy for sort of women on the ground, people that were in New York City who were, struggling, already having other children. And a lot of these were not out of marriage pregnancies either. A lot of these were pregnancies within the context of marriage too. And so there was this aspect of it that sort of got her involved and interested in it. She was also, however, interested in elevating the human race using birth control. And so she did see birth control as a method of helping to improve human heredity. So in this sense, she did have some of the same goals as the eugenics movement. However, interestingly, she had something of a love-hate relationship with the eugenics movement because a lot of eugenicists didn't approve of her methods because they were concerned that her basically, as they saw it, indiscriminate use of birth control, that is allowing people of upper class to use birth control and trying to make it available to everyone, that this was then going to limit the births of people with what they saw as good heredity. So the people who were promoting this positive eugenics idea that we have to have as many children as possible by the upper classes, they were concerned that Sanger's promotion of birth control might undermine that. They were all supportive of her trying to get birth control for the lower classes and for people, African Americans and others who they considered lesser or inferior, but they didn't like the idea that she was willing to go further and to try to promote the ready availability of birth control for basically anyone who wanted it, regardless of their hereditary makeup. So in that sense, some eugenicists didn't like her ideas, and so she never really fit in completely with the eugenics movement, even though she did share some of their goals. I mean, she did say that one of her mottos was to breed a race of thoroughbreds. That was one of the mottos that was placed on her birth control review, or whatever the name was of her journal. I'm trying to, I think it was birth control, but I might have that wrong slightly. But anyway, it was, to create a breed of thoroughbreds. That was one of her goals of her birth control movement. And there were some prominent eugenicists that did join her birth control movement as well. Lothrop Stoddard, if I recall correctly, was a member of her birth control movement. Sanger, though, has also received a lot of controversy because of her racism, because she also was racist and addressed the Ku Klux Klan at one point and did make clear that she did see non-whites as being inferior and was hopeful that her birth control movement would help to limit their births. Yeah,
it's interesting because the more I see that kind of thinking, I think, for me, I think I see it alive in many respects today. I know I've read some sources that from eugenists that were, when Hitler when it realized after the end of World War II what he was doing, I've read some things from some eugenists who really lamented the fact that, okay, now our work is going to be that much harder because people are going to associate us with these death camps and the other things. And so there was some discussions of how we could be a little bit more sly. How can we still get our ideas out and still fit within the new public standard that didn't want to see what happened in Germany happen? So there's a lot of underground stealth, at least from what I've read, as far as how they tried to promote themselves and the language that they tried to use in doing that. And I guess my question, this might be more controversial than other stuff, believe it or not, are there those ideas alive today in our medical field and in our public policy or in our academics that say, okay, this is something I need to be aware of?
When the word eugenics became sort of a naughty word in the post-World War II period, a lot of times they simply changed the names of their field, calling it human genetics or something else like that. And sometimes the same kinds of ideas were still being promoted at that time. The big difference, it seems to me, between eugenics today, which, again, I'd argue it does still exist in a lot of ways, but the big difference is that eugenics today, that is people trying to promote good heredity and trying to weed out, like with people with Down syndrome and such like that, those kinds of ideas that are still going around today, it's not being state imposed in the same way that it was in the early 20th century. So in the early 20th century, you had legislation that mandated that compulsory sterilization could take place. And so at state-run institutions, such as here in California, mental institutions and such, they were having the physicians and such at those institutions using the power of the state to compulsorily sterilize people. It was a state-mandated kind of institution. Today, eugenics is being done on a more voluntary basis. So it's being done by individuals. So an individual decides whether, when a person discovers that they have a baby in utero with Down syndrome, the individual decides whether they're going to carry that baby to term or whether they're going to abort that baby. Now, of course, there's social pressure. So when I say it's an individual decision, there's other things going on too. There's social pressure. In fact, I actually have a friend who had a baby with Down syndrome, and at the birth, the physician's response was, "How did this happen?"
Oh gosh.
Because he thought it shouldn't have happened.
Oh my goodness.
He thought that baby should have been aborted, and so he was horrified that this baby with Down syndrome had come into the world. So yeah, there's social pressure and such, but ultimately the individual does get to decide. Now, one time when I was challenged by someone about, these things aren't happening anymore. This eugenics in the early 20th century, being mandated by the government, these just aren't happening anymore. And someone was challenging me that. My response to that was, I'm not really sure that, millions of people making an individual decision for some particular thing somehow makes it better than a state-mandated thing. The issue is whether it's moral or not whether, how the decision-making process takes place. And so I think that's where we need to confront it. That's where we need to think about it. We need to think about is, eliminating people with disabilities through abortion, euthanasia, whatever, are these moral things to do or not? Not who gets to make the decision. Who gets to make the decision is important. I'm not saying it's not important. It is an important question too. But it's only an important question once you've decided the other question as to whether it should be legitimate at all. In other words, to think about the issue of, let's say, assisted suicide.
Yeah.
If assisted suicide is wrong, then there's there's no question that goes beyond that about who makes the decision, because there's no decision to be made.
Yeah.
Only if that is deemed to be a morally proper decision in the first place, would you then go to the next question and ask, well, who gets to decide? Does the individual get to decide? Does their family get to decide? Does the state get to decide? Who gets to decide what happens? First, you have to ask the question, is it moral in the first place?
Yeah.
And that's, to me, the more important question. And my own view in issues like assisted suicide and euthanasia, I don't think it's moral in the first place. I think there's strong arguments to be made morally against it. And so the next step of whether the individual decides or whether the collective decision, to me, that doesn't arise, because I think both of them are wrong.
Yeah, and I think maybe to relate that so people can understand, especially because, when you're committed to something, sometimes you can't see past the blinders of where you're at. So if we had go back, 50 years ago, when there was what they call redlining laws that didn't allow banks to loan to minorities because they came from depressed neighborhoods, and as a way of controlling certain things of where they could live, where there was realtors could lose their license if they sold a black person a home in a white neighborhood, those sort of things. So clearly we could say, okay, look, there's racism at play. But if we said, okay, those laws have been expunged, but I know this realtor guy who refuses to sell homes to the black people, or I know a doctor who refuses to do surgery because somebody's black, that wouldn't make it any better just because it's one person. It may not be as pervasive. It may not be as, maybe not be forced on people, but that doesn't make it morally any better. And I think if people think through that in the context of other issues, we wouldn't do that in those areas. So I think your argument here carries along the same line of thinking, whether it's through law or whether it's individual choice. If something is wrong, it's still wrong, regardless of the magnitude of it. So how can we as Christians, who are committed to this idea of the sacredness of every human person, how do we do a better job of protecting people from these sort of eugenics ideas? Is there something that, like, if you thought of this over years, is there some way, what could we do as individuals to do a better job of saying, I'm going to stand and protect these things somehow?
Well, I think one thing is we need to think through these issues in a way that gets at the root of the issues. I mean, I think you laid it out pretty well here too, that if you don't have a basis for believing in human equality, and that isn't based in humans being created in the image of God. I mean, you think about, Thomas Jefferson's dictum in the Declaration of Independence, where he said that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If we don't uphold those consistently everywhere in our thinking, then we can slip into these areas. And so I think part of what we need to do is sort of get to the root of the matters and make sure we uphold these ideas of human equality, of human the sanctity of life, which we could call it, or simply that human life has value, if you want to state it a different way, that human life is valuable just because it's human life, not because it has some particular characteristic about it, not because it has rationality, not because it has some other particular characteristic. In fact, one of the things when I debated Peter Singer on Unbelievable Radio, and in my debate, and you can go online and on their website and listen to that if you're interested. But when I debated Peter Singer, one of the things that I challenged him about was sort of the arbitrariness of the characteristics that they chose to define as what gives human life value. Well, we didn't say human life value. He'd say just what gives some life value.
Yeah.
And I challenged him and I said, look, Joseph Fletcher, who was one of the key leaders of bioethics in the mid-20th century, laid out 15 different characteristics of humans that he thought, endued them with value. Singer has several that he's bandied about: rationality, ability to plan the future, and things like that. And so I basically challenged him on that and said, how can you decide which of these features gives human life value? And Singer really didn't give me an adequate response. I was kind of stunned because this is sort of central to his whole view of humanity. I was kind of, but he said, well, we can discuss that. We can talk about which of these characteristics are. I thought he was going to have a knockdown argument for why his particular ones, were the ones.
Yeah.
But he didn't really give me that. I was kind of surprised at that. How do you determine when a being has that particular capacity?
Right. Well, they're certainly good points. And I think on the first point, whether the things that I've singled out or the broader range that Joseph Fletcher mentioned, as you say, or somebody else's view, I think that's a discussion we should be having. I think this discussion needs to be an open one. We need to think about these things. And perhaps we'll eventually reach some kind of consensus on what's important. Perhaps we'll have a range of differing views. Obviously, that can happen on ethical questions. We don't always end up agreeing. On the question of how do we determine, look, I think it's often difficult to determine, but for the purposes of making decisions, of the purposes of law, certainly, I think we should draw the line very conservatively. It's also very hard to determine when somebody has the capacity to be able to vote, for instance, or the capacity to be able to drive a car or to handle alcohol. But obviously, we do have laws that say that there are certain ages at which you can do those things. So we don't try and decide in each case. We could, I guess, try and give somebody tests before we allow them to vote, but it would be very cumbersome. We just set a line and we say, well, we think this is a reasonable place to draw the line. So I'm suggesting for these life and death decisions, we should clearly draw this line very conservatively and make sure that we're not allowing people to be killed when they do have, or when they possibly may have, some of the capacities that we might think to be relevant. Right, but the view that I draw the line at a month is a view that I put forward in a book published in 1984, and I can't remember exactly when, but certainly within the next 10 years, I said that I thought it was really not possible to just have an absolute cut-off line, but that the decisions ought to be weighed up by, for example, hospital ethics committees on the individual circumstances of the case. So in thinking about a month, I was thinking of that as a conservative line. That is, I think it's pretty clear that no infant less than a month old could have the capacities to see themselves as a self-aware being existing over time. And if you disagreed with that, then I think you would have to say, well, a lot of non-human animals would have those capacities as well, because a lot of non-human animals are going to be more self-aware, give more signs of that than a human infant of a month or something like a month old.
So anyway, I think emphasizing those elements, I think, is key, and making sure we keep those central, and then just trying to implement those in all areas of our life.
Yeah, I started a project for that conversation, actually, because it's been so significant. I started actually making these shirts that have in Hebrew, B'Tselem Elohim, from Genesis 1:27, which just says in the image of God, and trying to generate those conversations. Because I think even if people can't preach a sermon, if they can't write a book like you're writing, or or do whatever, everybody can have a conversation with their friend or their family member and say, what makes your life worthy of life, and is there some reason to devalue it based off if you're not as beautiful as Brad Pitt, or as smart as whoever, and I think just having those conversations, even as parents with kids, is pretty critical. So I'm hoping people will listen to a conversation like this and start having some conversations with family members and with their kids to get them thinking about these things before it's too late in their own life, where they've bought into something and without even realizing what the consequences of that are. So I appreciate your work and all that you're doing, and Godspeed and all the continue that. You're in semi-retirement now. Richard, thank you again for your time and for coming on the show. I appreciate it, and God bless you, man.
There's so much more we could say, but for now I want to encourage you to go out, till the soil of culture so that you can raise the roof on eugenics in all its modern forms and expose your friends and family to the beauty of God's good creation. I hope you'll come back and join me for the next episode. In the meantime, don't forget to follow and rate the show on your favorite podcasting service. And if you want to participate with me in a subscribers-only question and answer, you can sign up through my website, morethancake.org.